Greetings everyone, today I'm reviewing a slightly older lens which happens to have a very good reputation and has sold many copies, the Tamron 17-50mm f2.8 XR Di2LD aspherical IF lens. Let's just call it the Tamron 17-50mm f2.8. Be careful, don't confuse this with Tamron's newer VC version of the lens, which has image stabilization. This is the older, non-image stabilized version of the lens. Both of them are only compatible with Canon's APS-C digital cameras, like the Rebel series, 7D, 60D, 70D, 700D, and so on. Now, this lens is attractive for a lot of reasons. Firstly, it has a fast maximum aperture of f2.8 across its entire zoom range. This means it lets in a good amount of light, about twice as much as your kit lens does at wider angles and 4 times as much when you zoom in. This means your camera can use faster shutter speeds to get sharper pictures or stop action better. It's always good to use a lens that lets in a lot of light. It's also useful for video making. As you zoom this lens in, the light levels don't change, which makes video making much easier. The fast maximum aperture has another useful effect. It gives you a more out of focus background and foreground, which makes your pictures stand out much more. Here's a 50mm picture taken with an aperture of f5.6, which is what you'll find on your kit lens. Here's the same picture taken at f2.8. As you can see, the background is nicely out of focus while the subject remains sharp. So this lens can also work okay as a portrait lens. Another major attraction of this lens is its very low price point. I got mine for only £150 on eBay, and you can still get a new copy for around £200 or $300. Canon's equivalent version of this lens is about 3 times more expensive, although admittedly it does have image stabilization. But still, £200 for a fast standard zoom lens is really fantastic value for money. But anyone who saw my last lens review will know that good value doesn't necessarily mean good quality, certainly in Tamron land. How does this older lens shape up today? Well, I like the build quality of this lens a lot. The lens is surprisingly small for a fast standard zoom lens, especially compared to the enormous equivalent lens from Canon. The Tamron lens isn't too much bigger than a typical kit lens, so it's easy to carry around with you. The lens feels nice and solid, and as you can see here, the zoom ring is nice and smooth to use. It has a lock switch to prevent zoom creeping, but really, the zoom ring is firm enough never to need this, so it's a bit superfluous. The focus ring doesn't travel very far, which makes precise focusing a little tricky, but actually it's not too bad as the focus ring itself is very smooth. The front element doesn't turn or extend as you focus, which is particularly useful for people using filters. It's just a professional touch. Less professional, however, is the lack of full-time manual focusing. If you switch the lens to autofocus, then you shouldn't touch the focus ring. If you force it around, you might damage the autofocus motor. Unfortunately, the autofocus motor is a bit noisy, as you can hear. But it's also very quick and very accurate, which is good. The zoom range of 17-50mm is really nice for general purpose shooting, although admittedly it's not very different from your kit lens. It goes from nicely wide angle to short telephoto. All in all, the lens is pretty nifty. It's small, built nicely, and it works really well in use. Let's look at the image quality. This lens was released back in 2006, so let's see how it works on my Canon 60D with its modern 18-megapixel sensor. First, let's zoom out to 17mm. The lens is nice and sharp in the middle of the image with good contrast and no chromatic aberration. If we look a bit more in the corners, some chromatic aberrations do pop up. You might be able to see green and purple in the edges of the window frames. The lens remains fairly sharp though, and it's only in the very extreme corners that you can see softness. The lens gets progressively sharper as we stop the aperture down to f4, then f5.6, then f8, where the lens becomes very sharp from corner to corner. The chromatic aberration never really clears up at 17mm, but it's not too bad either. And we see back in the middle, the lens remains very sharp. So at 17mm we can say the lens performs pretty well. Let's zoom in to 28mm. The middle of the image is fairly sharp, but the contrast is slightly lower than it could be. If we move over and look in the corners, the picture is again slightly less sharp, but it's still decent enough. There's just a little chromatic aberration visible in the windows. When we stop down to f4, the image quality immediately picks up and the lens is very nice and sharp, getting even better at f5.6 with almost no aberrations. The center of the image is extremely sharp too. So again, the lens gives a very nice performance. Finally, let's zoom in all the way to 50mm. With the lens wide open at f2.8, the sharpness in the center of the image is just good, and again, there's a bit less contrast. In the corners we can see some softness unfortunately, but no chromatic aberration. So let's stop the lens down to f4. Now the story is different, and there's a lot more sharpness, and the picture quality in the middle of the image also becomes very good. Stop down to f5.6, and the image quality is excellent, even as we move over and look in the corners. So let's summarize. This lens turns in a good performance, but it's also showing its age a little. At f2.8, the image quality is somewhat up and down, but you couldn't call it bad. In fact, it's pretty sharp at wider angles, and the lack of chromatic aberration is certainly admirable. When you stop the lens down to f4, then the image quality is great, no matter what you do. You can get sharper lenses than this, for example, the Canon 17-55mm f2.8 IS. But considering its price, the Tamron 70-50mm f2.8 is really a good little performer. I can't imagine anyone being outright unhappy with this lens's image quality. All in all, pretty good. Let's look at some other image quality attributes. Firstly, the lens can focus pretty close to your subject, closer than others do. But as you can see here, the close-up image quality is a bit on the soft side, getting a bit better at f4, but only becoming good at f5.6. At least you can get close in the first place. Let's have a look at vignetting and distortion. Firstly, this lens exhibits some pretty strong vignetting when the aperture is wide open at f2.8. Just look at those dark corners. They're pretty noticeable in everyday photography. Stopping down to f4 does help, but we can safely say that vignetting is a weakness of this lens. What doesn't go away when you stop down to f4 is the barrel distortion. As you can see at 17mm, the lines in this picture are bulging outwards a little bit. This isn't good, but it's a bit lower than average for this kind of lens, so I'm happy enough. Zoom in to 24mm and the distortion straightens out, and at 50mm it turns to mild pincushion distortion. So distortion is visible, but it's not quite as bad as the average zoom lens. On this lens, the quality of the background blur, or the bokeh, is quite nice. Generally, it stays quite smooth. But as you can see in this picture, complex backgrounds such as foliage can get quite busy looking. As you can see in this footage, the lens handles bright lights fairly well. Flare and lack of contrast doesn't seem to be an enormous problem. On the whole, this could be a fairly useful lens for video work, but the fly in the ointment for this lens is the sad lack of image stabilization. As you can see in this footage, the picture is a little shaky, especially when the lens is zoomed in. This will be a bigger problem for people who want to do handheld video work than it is for stills photographers, as the fast maximum aperture of f2.8 will help them to get the faster shutter speeds they need. But I like video work a lot, so that's a disappointment for me. But it is an older lens, and it's such incredibly good value for money that you simply can't complain. Overall, I actually think this is a lovely camera lens, and I really enjoyed testing it out. The constant f2.8 maximum aperture is really nice for any camera lens, and this one is so compact and high quality that it really would be a great upgrade to your kit lens if you don't have a lot of money. If you don't mind the vignetting and lack of image stabilization, and you're on the market for something that's excellent value, then I can highly recommend this lens.